Thanks for downloading this episode of the BimTube podcast. Just a reminder that you can access all the podcasts in video and audio if you visit bim.tube. So our website again is at bim.tube. We hope you enjoy this episode. Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of the BimTube podcast. Today I've got Matt Lever with me, so thank you for joining me, Matt.
Hi Steve, hi everyone.
Very pleased to welcome you. As with a few other people, but especially with yourself, it's taken us a few months to get together because we're very busy people, aren't we? So thank you so much for taking the time, and I'm pleased that you're here at last. So let's get on with it. So I've known you for several years, probably over a decade, way back when with AGI days. But for the benefit of people listening or watching, please could you introduce yourself? And most importantly, can you just give us a brief history of your career and how you've got to the role that you're in today, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think it's probably nearly 10 years that you and I have been working together. Yeah, for sure. Yes, I'm Matt Lever. My current role is I am the Global GIS Platform Director for Arcadis, which is a large AEC, multinational AEC company based in the Netherlands, but global. So that's my current job, and I'm a GIS guy. So I began my career, I suppose, in GIS back in 1997. I'll start there. That's when I went to university and did geography, and that was, my geography degree was where I really first found out about GIS. I think I used ArcInfo, and there was digitizing on tablets and all that sort of thing back in '98. After that, I did an MSc in GIS and remote sensing at the University of Greenwich. I decided that GIS was where I wanted to focus, so that was very good. And then I had to get a job, right? So my first job was with a company called Siemens Aerofilms, based in Cheddar in Somerset, and we worked basically producing ordnance survey maps. We were on the master map program, correcting the old ordnance survey maps and putting them into the right position digitally and updating them. It was part of what was known as the OS Positional Accuracy Improvement Program back in the early days. That was 2003. So I did that for a couple of years. It was very exciting. And then after that, I got a job at Capita. And that was really my first AEC role, I suppose. That was 2005, and I was there for a couple of years, and I worked in the flood risk team, applying GIS to flood risk. So GIS was used to generate flood outlines from model results. And at that time, it was not long after the floods in 2000 in the UK. So there was a lot of money being spent on improving flood outlines all over the place. So people who are familiar with flood zones, flood map, that's all derived from that work that was done back in the early 2000s, and is still ongoing now. I then spent a couple of years at the National Health Service doing GIS in the health sector. So that was a bit of a change of direction in terms of discipline. I did that for a couple of years, and actually then I also took on an information management role when I was there, so a bit broader than just GIS. And then I think it was 2012, it was 2012, I joined what was then Hyder Consulting, AEC firm, UK owned at the time, and then that was purchased by Arcadis in 2014. So I've been at Hyder and Arcadis now for just over 10 years, and I started off as a GIS, the only GIS person actually in Hyder UK at the time, doing that role, and then I went on to lead a team. We got to about, I guess, 30 or 40 staff. And then I moved into a global role a couple of years ago now. So I'm now working with teams across Arcadis to helping them get the best out of GIS on their projects. Part of that as well is obviously the interface with the BIM world, and how we make sure the information management is being done well, regardless of the tool set across our projects.
Great, thanks, Matt. So yeah, an interesting journey, and I picked up the fact you mentioned information management. Of course, what I should have said at the beginning for the benefit of people that haven't listened or watched one of these podcasts before is BIM. I do mean, just to confuse people, maybe better information management. So the digital, you and I have been involved in information management for all our career in some form. So therefore, professionally, but I guess that's the point of this podcast, is it's becoming a thing, as we've already discussed. I mean, have you got anything to add or discuss about the fact that information management has always been profession, but now it's mainstream?
Yeah.
And what that means? I mean, this is the challenge, right? But anyway, sorry, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, even 10 years ago, information management was not a widely discussed topic in, certainly not the AEC companies where I worked. It was a bit of a hard sell if you said, "Oh, I can join your work on your project and do some good information management for you." You know, the project managers would look at you and say, "Well, why would I want to spend my money on that? You know, I'm trying to get a design out the door. I don't really need this information management." And I suppose it's a reflection of the AEC sector is, I think, quite well known to be slightly less mature in the digital space than some other sectors. If we compare that to, let's say, local government, which was implementing enterprise GIS in the early 2000s, to manage information, their system of record, AECs were not doing that at that time. And it was really, I think, I guess, two things which changed that. One was that the 2016 BIM mandate from government, that all public sector projects had to be done to, I think, BIM level 2, I think was the guidance. And that really drove a lot of new behaviors and ways of working in terms of how people thought about design information. It's no longer just CAD management, which had always kind of been there, certainly in my working life. Although I do know people who will tell you that that's quite new as well, depending on how far you want to go back. But yeah, that was one thing. And I think the other thing is that there were just some big transformational projects that have happened, I think, Steve, in the lifetime of our careers, whether that's the Olympic Games, 2012 Olympic Games, whether that's a Crossrail, or some of the other big ones that are happening now, Thames Tideway Tunnel. These were big projects which generated so much information that it just had to be managed in a more structured way. And I think that, combined with that increase in the the kind of the maturity of BIM and that mandate to use it on projects, really made information management a thing. Now it was a role. People had to pay people to do this role. It wasn't just, well, the GIS guy would manage his files pretty well because he was always going to work with some shape files, and so we needed to have a good folder structure. It was a complete level beyond that. And the fact that the recognition, well, now we've got to share data with each other in a standard way, and that's driven a whole kind of sea change in the way that information management is talked about and the way it's done.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. You mentioned there the BIM level 2, of course, that, for the benefit not of you, but of people listening and watching, that's evolved into international best practice standards, ISO 19650 suite, and in the UK BIM framework. And I think that, mentioning that, or I think that literally was a line in the sand, sort of coming, say, well, there is a mandate. And have you got anything to add about? I know you've touched on it there, but any other examples, maybe internally? Obviously, you don't have to name clients, but sort of around internal mandation, or people would, I hope, agree that managing information effectively and efficiently is a good thing, but you've got to make people do it. Have you got anything to say around the mandation of?
Yeah, because I mean, I think so we're not just doing it for the sake of it, right? So, and it's part of a bigger digital transformation that's happening in the AEC sector as a whole, right? So, if you're starting to manage your information digitally, then that starts to open the doors for you to do other things with that information in the future. It starts to open the doors around new business models, new revenue streams, right? So I think there was quite a quick recognition in those early days that actually, yeah, we've got to meet the mandate, but actually the industry's digitizing as a whole as well. That means that the game is going to change in terms of where we're making money, right? So a lot of AECs have gone through this digital transformation process, of which the information management part is like a foundational level. But certainly, in places where I've worked, that there's been a bit of a top-down kind of recognition that we've got to do this, and so a whole range of digital initiatives. We had them in Arcadis as well. I think we had 100% BIM, which was the aim to try and get all of our, as many of our design projects of a certain size to the level 2 BIM compliance, for example. Internal training initiatives. So again, I'll just use the Arcadis example. We've got something called Expedition DNA, which is trying to elevate the digital skills of your designers, your environmental specialists, anyone in the company, right? So that top-down mandate, I think, has really helped drive it, because previous to that, it was always kind of bottom up. Oh, I'm the GIS guy. I can do some good information management for you. BIM guys over here. I'm going to do some, some ad management, some BIM management. But it depended who you got on your project as to whether or not that happened. The fact that it was now being mandated from the top down made it normal, and it's kind of helped to make that organizational change in the way that we work with information. And it's not just in the companies where I've worked; it's happening everywhere, right? Because that's why now you see it in tenders, you see it when you're talking with clients. It's recognized as a thing, and that really kind of takes me on to my second point, was that it works better when you've got a standard. And I think for a long time, and it's probably still the case now, everyone's at different stages with this, but if you're working on a project where the client is quite digitally mature and they mandate a standard for you to use, then that makes it much easier to collaborate, right? So everyone's on the same page. There's a recognition that there's a certain information deliverables that have to be met and delivered, and it's not just a national task which you pay a guy to do keep your information in good working order. It's actually something which is resulting in a deliverable which you're going to be paid for. That really focuses the mind in terms of budgets and and project management. And better standards means better data, and clients recognize that now. And so I think we see it across all stages of the digital asset lifecycle, whether that's in asset management, whether that's in procuring projects, or in design teams. The idea that you need these standards is really important. And I guess it's still quite variable. That's the thing I would say. It depends very much on your client, depends on the vendors they're using for their information management. And I think that's something which we're continuously have to work through.
But I agree about there's variation. I mean, that's you get it across the board. But I think there's still a common approach. You know what I mean? How it's like an expectation, like the point you've made. There's sort of a minimum expectation nowadays. How it's handled and literally implemented is, that's the hard bit. So, but I think, I agree with you. There's sort of a sea change in things moving. Just sorry, have you got something to add on that?
Well, I was just thinking of some examples of sort of where it's worked really and where it hasn't worked. I mean, I remember back in, I think it's probably 2006, 2007, working on the Environment Agency National Flood and Coastal Defence database data. So I talked about how I worked on the sort of flood risk mapping projects. So there was a standard for delivering that data, which the Environment Agency wanted. So it was really easy to make sure you knew what you were delivering and then and get the data right. And I remember we used to have a validation tool to run the data through the validation tool to see if it would meet the standard. And it was almost, we have this game, could you get a hole in one and get it through the validation tool first time? And, and that was a really great early example. But again, the flood sector has always been quite information focused within AEC. And I think, it's the rest of the kind of design in the sort of civil and structural engineering, which is sort of caught up since then. So, even when I started at Hyder, we were working in highways. It was really the environment part of highways where there was a standard that we could use for the data. There was CAD standards, but there wasn't really information standards. And I look at some of the projects we have now, the big mega projects, which I won't necessarily name, but there's really detailed defined standards there that, is making it not very easy, but it's certainly providing that common language and framework for people to apply their skills and deliver value through providing good information to support those projects. And I have to say, I suppose if I'm being cynical, if those standards didn't exist and the requirements for information weren't built into those tenders, would those people be doing it, right? So, because ultimately AEC companies will deliver what's in the scope.
Yes, and I mean, it's interesting. So just to pick up a couple of points, it's interesting you mentioned the Environment Agency. Then I would say at this point they're one of the more mature, one of the most mature sort of government entities in the United Kingdom, and we point consistently toward them. But just my observation would be, because they're asset centric, Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. Obviously, by definition, today we are focused quite rightly on AEC, for architecture, engineering, and construction, for the few people that are not clear what that is. And but nevertheless, you see, my observation would be that you see the most maturity in clients that are owner operation focused or strategic asset management focused. And I think having that strong client, I know you've made this point, but I didn't know if there are any other examples of where there's a strong, I know you mentioned highways, but are there any others? Just as a list, just to show people that there is a diversity of sectors that are.
Yeah, and I think it really is quite diverse. So that's a really good point about the asset owner operator, and I think that sort of reflects the fact that let's think, I can't remember what the statistic is, but obviously most assets already exist, right, by definition. So there was obvious benefits for GIS back in the early days for that type of work. Typically as well, the budgets were there to support investment in information management technology like GIS to help build those systems of record. It was such an obvious use case. So we've got, in terms of that list, local authorities. I've worked with local authority drainage teams, highway drainage team, where they've got thousands of gullies and manhole covers and things that they have to inspect. The National Health Service. So whether that's their built estate, because NHS has a lot of buildings, or whether it's things like the locations of different medical facilities, right? They still need to know, for example, where services are located to be able to provide them to people. So that's a completely different kind of use case to just the built assets. And then obviously rail, highways we talked about already. And then environment. I mean, I worked on a fantastic project for Natural England when I started at my current employer, and we were doing a really interesting of new habitats, great crested new habitats, using mobile GIS data collection and then storing that in an enterprise database and preparing it and sharing it back to the client. I remember it really well because we provided metadata, really good metadata for the client, and they were very happy that we did that because not everyone did or does still provide that metadata. So, but yeah, so from newts to health services to local authority drain covers, and actually I've worked on golf course potential golf course location projects, right? So again, you need the data to be able to kind of identify suitable sites for future golf courses. That's something that I worked on for as part of the Welsh Ryder Cup bid. We're trying to identify legacy golf course locations. So very diverse range of assets.
Thanks, Mike. I was just going to say that exactly. Very diverse, and I think that's I often see people trying to look for differences in, maybe this is human nature. We don't get too deep on this podcast. It's just meant to wayfind people into where they should. But nevertheless, the commonalities that we see across the different domains and sectors and industries they're just so self-evident, right? But asset register, you think, well, it could be any set. But I do. It's almost like people are looking for the differences sometimes. Do you know what I mean? Or maybe they, for some reason, people can't latch onto the commonalities quickly enough. I don't know. We've sort of already touched on that, but have you got anything else to add, particularly around metadata registers? You could go to any domain and say, do you know what I mean? It's the same requirements, but people find it hard to break down industry silos. Have you found that?
They do, and I think, everyone's coming at information from their own angle, right? Everyone's got a different background. I think the interesting thing about GIS, I'm focusing on GIS professionals just because that's my background, right? I could be talking about any kind of information specialist, but I'm coming at it from a GIS person's background, right? So I'm looking at the geography, and for me, I think about applied geography. I think, well, what's the location? How does it relate to other things in that space? That's my mindset. That's what I'm looking at, and that's why I've been able to apply it to rivers and health and golf courses and great crested newts and all this. But actually, if you're coming at it from a very specific discipline background, maybe you're the highway drainage specialist or the railway engineer, you're focused on that. You're not thinking about necessarily the geography, and I think this sort of leads to my last point, which is that the magic happens at the edges, and I can't take credit for that phrase because a good colleague of mine gentleman called Mark Shaw, who I work with, he was always very adamant the magic happens at the edges. So the idea that when you bring different technical disciplines together, then and get them talking the same language, then they can really start to innovate. So as I said, I've worked in health, I've worked in engineering, but I remember in my job interview for my role at the health service, they asked me to explain the relationship between primary and secondary care. I had no idea. And when I joined Hyder, they said, okay, great, well, here's the ground engineering team, they're going to do a GI tomorrow. Yeah, they're going to need some help with managing their GI data. I'd never worked with GI data before in my life. And so I've learned bits about these disciplines, but I will never know what a civil engineer knows, or a ground investigation engineer knows, or a health procurement specialist will know. But what you've got to be able to do is be able to show them the art of the possible, so that then we could talk the same language. We did some fantastic work a couple of years ago at Arcadis, which with our ground engineering team, around looking at ways that we could automate earthwork design selection from a standardized set of designs based on the geography. If you've got the terrain along your entire stretch of a linear asset, and a standardized set of designs that are going to be used depending on a certain predefined set of conditions, then you're able to go along and assess each location on its merits and make a decision there using GIS. But we could only have that conversation because the engineers we were working with, we'd already spent several years getting them used to working with GIS. They were using ArcMap to look at their designs and were starting to ask questions of us. Hey, can we do this with this data? If we prepare this data like this, can we then run these queries on it to generate this set of outputs? Because this would allow us to save X amount of hours on this, really long, 13-mile scheme. And so that's been fantastic. And I think as I've been, certainly in the last 10 years with my current employer, that the amount of because of that top-down mandate we talked about earlier, the digital skills now that the average engineer or environmental specialist has is significantly more than they had, say, 10 years ago when I started. So 10 years ago, it was very much, in the kingdom of the blind. I was able to, impress people with my WYSI maps and my Python scripts. Now everyone can do it. So but that's good, because now we're doing higher value things with the data and automating more, getting better value for clients, asking more relevant questions, making better decisions using geography. One thing I would say though is that whilst that is fantastic, there's still some structural challenges around that, right? So if everyone else is now digital and really good at information management, well, what's the role for the information management people? Yeah, so it's no good if you were a GIS guy who started at a design company 10 years ago and you're impressing people with your maps and your basic Python scripts. Well, newsflash, no one's really using those PDF maps anymore because everything's online and self-service, and engineers are learning Python at university and and applying it on their projects in far more complicated and sophisticated ways than you probably would have done in your GIS app. So what's the niche for you? So those individuals, you've got to almost move on to the next bit, then to keep that innovation going, you've got to elevate your skills and move on to the next sort of technical challenge, really.
I completely agree. Certainly it was technical, loosely based on one of the Gartner data knowledge. I often like to think about earlier in my career, and I'm sure it's the same with you, it was the technical and the technology, right, was the challenge and the limitations, then the information or data or lack of, and then we're sort of going up the value chain. I mean, again, there's a parallel, isn't there? I often think one of the challenges now is just which you identified, but is knowledge management. I don't want to go off on tangents on knowledge management. I realize it's something else, but that business continuity, resilience, and trying to, like we're talking about, or you've been talking about automating workflows or business processes. And I think once people come at it from that angle, to say we are automating things, we're taking the business knowledge and putting it. Have you got anything to say about sort of knowledge management, or because I think business continuity and resilience, as in the infrastructure resilience of the technology in this case, people don't talk about it enough, and I think that's a huge reason why we're doing these things.
And I suppose 10 years ago, when I came along and did like a Python script to produce, I don't know, 3,000 maps in a morning. I was there. Happy days, everyone was really impressed. We, got all these maps out, what have you. And I did that, me and my colleague in our little team, to meet a specific individual project need. The project manager was super happy, and we met the ridiculous time scale that we were supposed to deliver to. But it was an isolated little bit of innovation that we did. There was no standardization across the company in any way. And I suppose you could take what we did there, and I'd be naive to think it wasn't happening in probably thousands of other little pockets of both the company I was working in and all the other AEC companies all over the industry, right? So we had a really uncoordinated, fragmented world where loads of great innovation was happening, but actually the potential to scale that and get a bigger return on investment was very limited. So what we see now, to address exactly what you're asking, Steve, is, well, we've got to be much more joined up. We've got to be much more focused. And we've got to think about things we probably didn't think about before. So first of all, yeah, how do you standardize across a whole company or a whole industry? That takes a lot of time and effort and investment. I think all AECs are on that journey, and it's not easy because those light bulb moments are still happening all over the place. You don't want to stifle people's creativity, but at the same time, you've got to kind of put some of your eggs in a few but less baskets. Otherwise, you're going to continue to be fragmented. The other thing is, if you're going to put your eggs in those baskets, you're going to really rely on them more than when you had lots of individual little fragmented solutions. So if you're going to rely on something, it's going to become much more business critical. Then you need to be pretty sure it's going to work. And so exactly as you said around the sort of investment in the technology, that technology's got to be resilient. It's got to meet the performance expectations of your teams and your clients and your corporate governance. It's got to be secure. It's got to be updatable. You've got to be able to decouple from the vendor in the future if you want to take a different path. You've got to, it's got to be able to grow without breaking the bank. All of these things also take time and effort. The fact my actual current job didn't exist 3 years ago because well, it was created in recognition there was a need to start coordinating some of the GIS stuff around our technology, in a more standardized way. And so to do that, you need a platform owner. So we've got similar roles to mine across other technologies in the company, in recognition that this coordination, this standardization doesn't happen overnight. And actually, as well as my role, there's a whole heap of other roles designed to help kind of standardize how we do our development as in the company, whether that's professional development by professional developers, whether it's the engineers themselves doing their own development, what we call citizen development. We want them to be able to create stuff which can be reused. So coordinating all that, huge investment. And I suppose, and it's fantastic to see, but it gives you an example of the sort of change that is happening. We talked about information management at the start, and it seems like, well, yeah, of course, why would you not want to manage your information better? But actually, the knock-on consequences of doing that and the change to the way companies operate and their business models is still working itself through. So AECs, their kind of prime way of making money is brain power by the hour, right? I basically will charge you a fee for doing a certain amount of work. Well, if you've automated all that work, so it only takes you an hour, well, there's a slight, discord there, right? Because you're no longer, working as many hours, so you've got to change your commercial model, right? So that journey is ongoing, I think, for a lot of ACs at the moment.
I think that's a very good point you made about the how you charge, because I don't bottom out the conversation, but often I'll throw into, when I do training, I'll say efficiency isn't good for maybe most people, right? Depend in a company, and exactly what your point is. And I think having that different business model, that no longer obviously is a technical challenge. It's a change management, I guess. And I know you've identified some of the challenges, but for someone starting out on this journey, because you literally are a personification of a horizontal role at a global scale, but there aren't that many of you, and none of you in most companies probably. So if someone were to, maybe it's not their full-time job, but where would you start? I mean, where does one start if they're on a limited budget? Is it, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is it things like comms? Is it the non-obvious things if you're a technology specialist? what would you recommend for someone if they had limited resource, and what do they focus on?
As a company trying to,
yeah, corporate, right?
yeah,
So, for
yeah.
example, in this hypothetical scenario, it's not actually technically my role, but one of the directors at a company has said, right, can you explore how we might pull together a corporate function? In this case, yeah, let's talk about GIS. Again, I will put words in your mouth, but often it's things like improving communication or stating what the business challenges are. It's probably not pulling databases together initially. Have you got any thoughts around that? Or bear in mind, for people that haven't done this before,
Yeah,
my experience is they start with the wrong thing. They go in only at the tech level and actually haven't nailed the sorry, I'm giving your answer here, but any thoughts about
I mean, for me, it's all about the people, right? So you've got to focus on the people and the skills and the culture. That's gonna drive the change, and you need that top-down buy-in, right? So I mean, I've got to where I am. I'm very fortunate. I've had champions working above me who had a vision around what they wanted, the company to do, and that has opened doors for me, allowed me to, certainly my current employer, it was just me in 2012 when I joined. By the end of 2013, it was still just me. By the end of 2014, there was 7 of us. By the end of 2015, I think there was 20 of us. But that growth was only possible because we did great work on projects, but we only got work on those projects because there was champions and people speaking on our behalf saying, hey, look, we've got a center of excellence here of people with these skills who can add value to your projects and add value to your clients. That we did the work, we had good people in our team, and that's, I think, that's why I say it's about the people, because ultimately you get the right people who deliver well, then obviously that creates its own momentum. Clients, internal or external, will see the value and will continue to work with you, and you'll be able to grow there. So it's around people, it's around skills. One of my things at the moment is around how do we upskill, all those GIS people I was telling you about who used to do the maps, or how do we equip them to meet the needs of AECs in the future? When we're talking about GeoBIM, we're talking about digital twins, we're talking about, big data analytics. So, how can we give them the skills to be able to thrive in that environment and move on from what they were doing? So, we've got good people, but the pace of technological change means that everyone's got to continue to learn. Right. So how do we make sure that we're supporting our people with that? Because when people leave, it's very disruptive, right? And that's something I think we're commonly recognised. So yeah, probably not a straight answer, but I think you're right. It's not focused on the tech. To a certain extent, the tech will follow what you want to do. You've got to start. I'm going to say this sounds a bit trite, but you start with the end in mind, right? If you've got people working who can communicate well with those other discipline specialists to make that magic happen at the edge, understand what the end goal is, what they're working towards, then the technology follows. So it's understanding the why, and then how you do it will follow. The why and the what, and then how you do it follows afterwards. And that's why part of my role is, well, I am managing a very large platform with some very big vendors, but I've got to be thinking ahead. Well, actually, in 5 years' time, what are we going to be doing? And what tools are we going to need to do the job then?
Yeah, and that's where that. So thank you. No, that was a great answer. Thanks, because again, what might seem obvious to you because it's your day job, and maybe to me sometimes isn't to other people. Like we said, it's about change management. By definition, it's strategic, right? You just said you're thinking ahead. Again, that wouldn't be instinctive for a lot of people. They won't necessarily be looking at business growth strategies. Do you know what I mean? That's not a GIS skill, is it? Anyway, so that is a different skill. Communication's a different skill. All the rest, presentation skill. A lot of people I know that don't even like, which is fine, don't even like presenting. No, which is fine.
But you touched on a really good point there, Steve, which is that actually one of the things I see sort of holding back. I use the phrase "our industry," which is but what I mean by that is, I guess, the further growth in the use of information management, whether that's BIM, GIS, on in AECs or in the sector as a whole, is the lack of people at a very senior level who are aware of the technology, who I guess people like yourself and me who've done it. We've got to, I guess, 20 years in now, and we can, we can lead on big jobs. We can, we're a safe pair of hands. We can mentor junior staff, recruit people in, and help build that next generation. Unfortunately, because the nature of the work we do is very technical, and people love the technical work they're doing, there's not a lot of people who kind of want to do both. They want to be technical, but also do those business things as well, and leadership things, which is what we need to be able to kind of continue to grow. And yeah, that's, I suppose, a bit of a concern. So if we were just stuck in our technical basements all day doing some amazing, technical innovation, that's great, but we've got to tell people about it, we've got to sell it, we've got to help others do it so it can be scaled, so that we can get the real benefits of doing that. And those things don't happen by themselves. And something I recognized probably 3 or 4 years ago when I first became a technical director at Arcadis is that, yeah, there is no one above me to talk about this anymore. I've actually got to be the one to promote all this stuff. And yeah, we need more people doing that, I think. More evangelists, people who can talk the language of the customer to help, grow what we do and add more value. Because I think we all recognize, you and I, Steve, have been to many conferences where they say, well, geospatial is so important for the challenges facing the world today. Well, it is, but we've got to let people know how we're going to meet those challenges. Otherwise, we'll do some great stuff, and our opportunity to save the world will have been missed.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, that's the essence of why I do this podcast as well. Just I'll throw in the word. What's your take on talking about digital twins? Does that help the conversation? Are you talking about it with your clients or at work? And what do you think about it? It's not a loaded question. Whatever, you might not have much to say about it, but what do you think about digital twins?
I mean, yes, everyone's talking about it, aren't they? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I actually talked about it. I think at the Esri UK annual conference, I presented on this at the exec breakfast, and I'm still learning. I think we all are, about the potential for digital twins to add value. And I've been to a couple of good talks this year. I think some of the same ones that you've been to, Steve, actually, where it's just helped shape my thinking a little bit around this. If you'd asked me 12 months ago, a couple of years ago, I was even on a panel talking about digital twins at GeoBusiness, which, I'll be honest with you, I mean, I'm not sure I added a great deal of value on that particular panel at the time. But I think obviously the idea is maturing a bit here, and it's obviously quite a complex landscape, right? There's not just one definition of a digital twin. I've seen some stuff this year which has really kind of piqued my thinking. I think the Esri International IMGIS conference in Frankfurt that both you and I attended, there's some great talks on digital twins there, which got me thinking about geographical twins and the different ways that digital twins can, I guess, be manifested in GIS, and I think Charles Kennelly's given some great presentations on that, which really helped my thinking. But equally, I've also seen some other examples from within AEC sector looking at digital twins in MEP, for example, and how we're linking sensors and actually to the asset themselves and getting the asset to report back information to certain protocols, IoT standards, and then ingesting that and reporting it back. A completely different type of twin to, say, the geographical twins that we've seen in the GIS world, both equally valid. And I think for me, the essence is, well, you've got to have that real-time data to make it a twin. So because as soon as it's not real time, then it's out of date. It's no longer a twin. It no longer accurately represents what's in the real world. But there's different scales to that. There's different themes to that, and all sorts of dimensions. So there's not a catch-all. It's a pretty big ecosystem, I guess, is what I would say. So the people out there are listening to this, if you feel like you don't understand it yet and it seems big and confusing, that's okay, because it is. But what I would say is try and make it relevant to your work. Try and understand how it can relate to the work that you're doing, and then focus on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's that hook, isn't it? But and you mentioned the sensors or the connectivity. I think that's one of the observations I've got, having that, particularly with a GIS background like yourself, having that way of describing updating things or a feedback. The fact that we update things wasn't natural. GIS often, tragically, was the end of the game for survey, for CAD or whatever. And I think so. Even if we start talking about, well, there should be an update cycle, whether it's live or not is another thing. But anyway, so I like the term. I was at an event just last week on that. I mean, I don't have too long with you, but have you got anything to add just around? And I know you mentioned AI, I think, in passing, but again, this podcast is people that are maybe not involved in these things. They think, oh my God, there's AI, there's digital twins.
Right.
And do you talk about, and are you using artificial intelligence or machine learning, or are your colleagues? And in what context?
Okay, so we are.
Just an overview, because again, people think, oh, is it real? Will it ever happen? And people are using it right now, you know. So
it's 100% real, right? So there's various initiatives going on internally in the where I currently work. I won't go into too much detail about those, but I can certainly give some relevant examples that I've heard my colleagues talking about. So one of the great ways which AI, I guess. Well, let me pause a minute. So I think to those of us who are not, perhaps up to speed with the latest things like ChatGPT, etc., just take a step back and think that, well, AI and the idea of having a kind of knowledge-based system to help us make decisions. There's plenty of people who will tell you that in GIS we've been doing this for a long time. If you look at image classification techniques that have been used in remote sensing and GIS, and how you build knowledge-based classifiers to derive information, there's a strong argument which says, well, that is at some level artificial intelligence. But I think obviously now you can make that argument, but equally that it's quite clear with the advent of stuff like ChatGPT that the landscape has changed. Like someone said to me this week, well, this is like the invention of the car, right? This is and I sort of asked the question quite philosophically, well, okay, so is this going to define the 21st century? These are the sorts of questions we're talking about now with AI, right? So it's understandable that people will feel overwhelmed. But I think, I, like myself, read the newspaper headlines, online news headlines, worried about AI at a kind of, disruptive level for the whole of society. But someone very recently just showed me some of the ways it could be used for good. So, for example, you can use it to get a Python code to do a particular operation or routine. I saw someone type into ChatGPT, or show me how would I do an image classification with Python, and it returned the steps, and I reviewed them. I looked at them, I was like, to be fair, that's pretty good. That's kind of how I would do it. And the way it was sort of pitched to me as well, we can use this as a much better search engine, and rather than use a search engine and just return you a list of stuff which you have to search for yourself, it's trying to make some sense of it for you. And I think the idea that you can put in like some Python code, do a geoprocessing routine, and it will come back and it will correct it for you or give you alternatives, obviously has huge potential in terms of being an aid for us when we're doing our work. What I suppose I'm slightly more worried about is where I've seen it used for things like, oh, tell me about the top 3 things I should be thinking about today to do my job. I feel like that's kind of incumbent on us to be doing that thinking. So yeah, I think we're all coming into contact with it in ways that perhaps we hadn't expected before, and it's got a lot of potential. I look forward to it becoming a bit more mature and, I guess, normal and less scary. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I just thought I'd throw it in there because it's like your first point on this topic was arguably elements of the concepts of AI, if not by name, have existed. And I'm with you. I think it depends your take on it. But anyway, I'll move off that topic because I've only got 10 more minutes with you. Is there anything, and throw it open. This isn't rehearsed, people listening or watching. Is there anything you would like? I haven't done this before. You would like to talk about that I haven't asked you yet?
So what we see is that there's still a lot of silos in information management, and actually that's not that helpful. And I think if we look at BIM in particular and the way that evolved in the AEC sector, it was very CAD driven, CAD focused, and there was perhaps a sort of lack of recognition that, hey, actually on a big AEC project, probably the CAD data, the design data, is maybe only like 30%, if that, of all the data that's on the project, right? So who's actually applying the standards to the like the GIS data for the environment stuff or the ground stuff, or the information management protocols around our emails and general file management, right? So it's bigger than what you think it is. So I go into it with an open mind. I think if you're coming in from if you're starting out in the BIM world and you're really focused on design, be aware that there is a lot of other data digital disciplines out there already. The GIS world, I think, generally feels a bit aggrieved that it's been left behind because it was already being digital before BIM came along. I think a lot of people have got over that now, but be aware that there is a lot of geospatial data on projects. The fact that there's huge GIS systems on some of these mega schemes that we talked about earlier was for a reason, because there's data that needs to be managed. So, make sure you're thinking about that. And if you're coming at it from a GIS angle, be aware there's a whole lot of people out there who are really focused on very technical information management related to design. Your tools are probably not going to address that, but you need to work those individuals to make sure that as a team, we're getting the information management right as a whole, bringing the data together to allow the magic to happen at the edges and all that stuff. So keep an open mind, speak with your colleagues. That would be my kind of, I guess, one thing I would add.
Great, thank you. And I guess I did partly ask this before about change, but just to be explicit, again, sorry, putting you on the spot, but you can handle this. What's the message we give to chief executives? So sort of the concept of an elevator pitch. I mean, you don't have to exactly give an elevator pitch, but what do people focus on? Because I think that's where people don't have a good enough story. Do you know what I mean? To talk to a senior executive or a director or C-level, what's the values that, what do you talk about? Not necessarily what's an elevator pitch, not to put you on the spot, but what are the themes or topics? And again, for us, it might be self-evident, but again, for people watching that maybe don't talk to directors on a daily basis, what kind of things would you talk about? I mean, again, it might seem an obvious question, but surprisingly, people focus on the wrong things. They start talking about server variants. You think that's probably not the right topic, but anyway, sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, so I can partially answer that question. I think, again, I come at it from a very GIS based perspective, I suppose. I think in AECs, BIM has got a lot of headlines for the last 7 or 8 years because of the mandate, because of all the other noise. There's, it's been in all the industry magazines, BIM. No one really talks about GIS, and I think that's actually made it quite hard to address that. What I just talked about just now about addressing that broader information management landscape, the fact that we need skills from across a range of different technologies and specialisms to be able to do this. And so, part of what I always had to do is sort of, make the case for including GIS on a project. Why should we pay for 3 or 4 GIS staff to work on this job and this software, to help with the information management? And so, I'm not sure it's an elevator pitch, but what I always say is that you need to understand the geography. If you want to genuinely improve the quality of life of people, or have an asset which makes an impact in a positive way, you need to understand what the geography of that place is like now, and what the geography of the place is going to be like once you've finished, to understand how you're improving it. And if you want that geographical perspective, you need to use geographical tools and work with geographical information, and that's why you should use GIS. So that's kind of one of the things that I say, because as you said earlier, it's very easy just to be sucked into the technology, but actually it's the discipline, it's geography, it's geographical information geography that really I'm selling.
I think that's a great point. Again, it's maybe self-evident that it's geography, but people don't often say that. They don't actually say, because everyone gets geography, like conceptually, they go, okay, I get it. Like without any of the detail. Likewise with mapping, obviously I've got partly a background in mapping. I think, people get maps, and obviously they're geographically linked, but people can talk about that. It's a way in. So I think that's a really good point, like focus on the geography. Our time is nearly up, but so thank you so much. But are there any places that you would recommend people go to, either online or other resources, events or something that you'd recommend? So I put you on the spot again, any industry bodies or...
So, I mean, for me, I'm still always open to identifying new events for my career. I guess I typically tend to go to a certain number of pretty regular ones. So I will usually make an effort to go to the Association for Geographic Information, GEOCOM conference, because there's a thought leadership event around geographic information and digital geography. I think personally, I've struggled to find one that's better than that. I often go to the Esri events just because for me, I work heavily with the Esri products. And I think the other thing that I'm conscious that I should be doing more of is probably attending more events which aren't GIS related, that maybe are related to the disciplines I'm working in, to improve my understanding, of again, how technology can help those teams. So things like whether it's in ground engineering or health sector or whatever you're working in, again, take that time to learn about that discipline where you're applying your skills, so you can see how geography can add value.
Great, thank you. And I implied it, but I didn't ask directly. Is there a couple of websites that you recommend? Any that either news ones or industry ones that you recommend?
To be honest with you, I generally use LinkedIn.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine. Yeah, I've had that response before. No,
Yeah.
I'm with you. It's good. So thank you, Matt. Thanks so much for your time, your insight, and the examples. Critically, the examples again, because that's where it makes it tangible for people. This is your profession, but again, there's a lot of people new to these concepts that just, where do you start? What elements to look at? So thank you so much for the examples and case studies that you've shared. So thanks for your time, Matt Lever, and it was a pleasure to talk to you. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. No, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope everyone enjoys the podcast.